On Friday, July 13th, 2018, 40-year-old Daniel Mercer arrived at the northern shore of Lake Katusa in Louisiana. Daniel wasn't a careless adventurer or a man unfamiliar with the water. He was a seasoned kayaker, a competitor in local rowing events, and someone who often sought solitude in the rhythm of paddles cutting across still lakes. Friends described him as methodical and deliberate, someone who balanced an athletic spirit with a cautious nature. He wasn't the type to take foolish risks, and that made his sudden disappearance all the more unnerving. On this day, he had set his mind on exploring the eastern edge of the lake. Heavy rains earlier in the week had carved out new bays and hidden channels along the shoreline, places where the water lapped hungrily against eroded earth. For Daniel, that kind of change meant a chance to see the landscape from a new perspective, to experience something untouched and unfamiliar. The day before, he told friends of his plans. He would set out around 9 o'clock in the morning, paddle most of the day, and return by evening. It was a typical outing for him, nothing extraordinary, nothing that raised concern. At departure, the weather seemed to cooperate. The air was warm, hovering around 82 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat softened by a light southerly wind. Clouds drifted lazily across the sky, casting shifting shadows over the glossy surface of the lake. Yet the water was not in its usual state. Days of heavy rain had swollen the shoreline, raising water levels and carving away sections of land. In certain places, the ground had literally collapsed into the lake, leaving behind jagged cuts and precarious embankments. Daniel pulled into the gravel lot that morning in his dark blue Nissan Xterra, the same vehicle he used for years of trips into the wilderness. In the back, he carried his prized green single-seater Kayak, a sturdy vessel he had trusted on countless journeys. Alongside it were the essentials: a watertight container filled with personal belongings, a life jacket, a carbon fiber paddle, and a Canon camera secured in a protective case. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this ritual many times before. At roughly 8:30 a.m., he dragged the kayak down to a narrow wooden dock near an abandoned fishing base, a place silent and forgotten, its boards grey with age, its windows boarded shut. The base had not been used in years, but the dock still jutted stubbornly into the water, as if waiting for someone like Daniel to launch from it. 2 local fishermen were there that morning, men who would later provide some of the last living testimony of Daniel's presence. They said they didn't know him personally, but they saw him glide away from the dock, paddling confidently to the southeast. He wore a light-colored long-sleeve shirt, a baseball cap pulled low against the sun, and dark sunglasses. At that moment, nothing seemed unusual. Yet by 11 a.m., the last trace of Daniel was recorded, not by human eyes, but by technology. His cell phone sent a final signal to a tower on the southern side of the lake. Then, the line went silent. By midday, friends began trying to reach him. The calls went unanswered. By afternoon, his phone was no longer in range at all. When Daniel failed to return by evening, unease grew into alarm. His brother, Thomas Mercer, was the one who finally called parish police to report him missing. That same night, officers located his car parked at the very spot where he had entered the water. Inside, they found a bag of dry clothes, neatly folded, and a single bottle of water. It was as if Daniel had stepped out for just a moment, planning to come back, but he never did. The police wasted no time. That night, they began sweeping the shoreline within a mile of his departure point. 4 motorboats scoured the water, while a team of divers searched below the surface, their flashlights cutting through the murk. The operation lasted until dark and resumed at dawn. For 3 days, search teams combed the central areas of the lake and its narrow channels. They found nothing. No oars, no kayak fragments, no life jacket washed ashore. It was as if Daniel and his equipment had been erased from the lake itself. Residents were puzzled. That day, there had been no strong current on Lake Katusa. Without it, the kayak shouldn't have drifted far. But the shoreline told a different story. In one section, the ground had collapsed after the July rains, leaving raw earth crumbling into the water. Locals whispered about the lake's hidden dangers, underwater pits and karst sinkholes that sometimes opened without warning beneath the soft sediments. Some feared that Daniel's kayak might have slipped into such a hidden cavity, vanishing below where no one could see. Yet at the time, no fresh landslides had been reported. Authorities hesitated to treat the sinkhole theory as serious. After all, Daniel was careful. He wore his life jacket. He carried his waterproof bag. He was the kind of man who prepared for the worst. Police turned to surveillance cameras positioned around the area, hoping for clarity. But the footage was incomplete, fragments of recordings that revealed nothing about his final route. The only reliable confirmation remained the fishermen's testimony, their memory of him gliding away from the dock. By the end of the first week, with no leads and no new evidence, officials announced that the active search would be suspended. The official explanation leaned toward a drowning accident, but without a body, without debris, it was only speculation. Daniel's car was impounded in secure storage, and his belongings were returned to his grieving family. 7 days after his disappearance, on July 20th, 2018, nature itself shifted. A partial landslide shook the southern part of Lake Katusa, roughly 3.5 miles from where Daniel had launched. Fishermen who were nearby described hearing the ground crumble late in the morning. They saw a patch of shoreline collapse, the soil sliding into the water with a dull, cracking roar. Almost immediately, the lake's surface changed. The water darkened, murky swirls spreading outward like ink in a jar. Gas bubbles rose in clusters, breaking the surface with an eerie hiss. The parish water protection service arrived swiftly, concerned that more collapses could follow. Their inspection revealed something chilling. The collapse had opened a submerged crater, a funnel-shaped pit more than 15 feet deep. Beneath the surface, it connected to the main channel through an underwater tunnel. Preliminary analysis suggested erosion of rocks and tree roots had hollowed out the area, leaving the ground unstable. Since the crater was within the designated search zone for the missing kayaker, divers were immediately dispatched. What they discovered in the very first minutes of descent would stop them cold. Lying flat on the bottom, its hull intact, was a bright green kayak. There were no cracks, no sign of impact or struggle. The mooring line was still tied neatly to the bow, and on the deck an elastic cargo cord stretched firmly across. Inside the cockpit, strapped securely under the deck lines, was a sealed yellow PVC bag. The divers brought it to the surface, and in the presence of police officers, the bag was carefully opened. The discovery of Daniel's kayak inside that eerie underwater crater might have seemed like the final clue, but the mystery only deepened. While divers recovered his sealed yellow bag, the man himself remained missing, swallowed, it seemed, by the vast, unpredictable waters of Lake Katusa. And just when investigators thought they had exhausted every lead, new testimony surfaced from another troubling night on the same lake. On a warm Tuesday evening, not long after Daniel disappeared, local fishermen gathered on the southern stretch of Lake Katusa, drawn by the promise of flathead catfish that bite best after dusk. The air was heavy, buzzing with insects, and the water carried the faint smell of churned mud from the recent rains. Among those fishing that night was Raymond Ray Collier, who had brought his nephew along to teach him the old tricks of night fishing. What he witnessed would stay with him. Around 9:30 p.m., Raymond noticed something strange. a white motorboat cutting across the dark surface of the lake without its running lights on. In the blackness, it seemed almost spectral, visible only by a faint green glow he thought might have come from sonar equipment mounted to one side of the driver's console. The boat moved fast, too fast for these waters, and headed directly toward a pair of kayakers who were fishing not far from shore. Raymond said it struck him immediately as dangerous. Boats weren't supposed to be running blind on the lake after sundown. 10 minutes later, chaos erupted on the shoreline. Emergency lights pierced the night. Rescue crews rushed into the water, and word spread quickly. One of the kayakers was missing. The surviving kayaker managed to pull himself ashore, shaken and gasping, and spoke through a haze of shock. "The boat hit my friend," he told rescuers. But the details blurred. Had the boat actually collided with the kayak, or had its violent wake overturned the vessel and dragged the paddler under? At that moment, no one could say for sure. The parish fire department and Louisiana water safety officers launched an all-night operation. Divers slipped beneath the dark surface, while motorboats swept the shoreline, their spotlights cutting through cattails and reeds. Sonar scans dragged across the lakebed, mapping every depression, every log, every possible resting place for a missing man. 7 hours passed, then 8. The night gave way to dawn, and yet nothing surfaced. No fragments of a kayak, no paddle, no body sights. By sunrise, officials conceded what the families feared. This was no longer a rescue, but a recovery mission. A grim shift in language, but one forced by the silence of the water. The boat was involved, the parish fire chief admitted, but we don't know exactly what happened. The investigation into the unidentified vessel began immediately, but answers proved elusive. Witnesses like Raymond were left shaken, replaying the scene over and over in their minds. "It's crazy to think about," he told reporters, staring out at the same stretch of water. "I saw him just minutes before, kayaking. And then he was gone. It makes you realize you've got to take precautions. Wear a life jacket. Make sure people can see you. And if you're running a boat, you'd better have the lights on." The irony stung deeply. Lake Katusa had no strong currents that evening, no heavy winds, nothing in the environment that should have made a kayaker disappear. And yet, for the second time in as many weeks, a man vanished into its depths as if erased. The whispers about the unlit motorboat that sped across Lake Katusa on the night of the second disappearance could not be ignored. Witnesses had seen it cut through the black water, its faint sonar glow the only mark of its presence. They saw kayakers struggling in its wake. They saw one vanish. For investigators, those statements became an ominous echo, especially when tied to what was pulled from the underwater crater. Back to the PVC bag's discovery. Inside it, investigators found Daniel's driver's license, a plastic wallet holding his bank cards, and a small Canon digital camera in a protective case, along with 3 spare batteries. It was a meticulous inventory, the kind Daniel was known to carry. No rips, no tears, no signs of violence on the bag itself. But what struck investigators hardest was what was missing. No life jacket anywhere near the kayak, even though family members insisted Daniel never paddled without one. His paddle was absent as well. The crater yielded only broken branches and fragments of rusted fishing gear. Nothing else. The walls of the funnel loomed unstable, forcing divers to halt before going deeper. Theories began to split in 2. The first, an accident, that the kayak had been dragged into the crater during a collapse. The second, darker theory, suggested deliberate placement. Someone had hidden the kayak in the funnel to erase evidence. The problem was timing. At the moment of Daniel's disappearance, the shoreline had been stable. Experts said it was extremely unlikely The kayak had simply fallen in by chance. When the Canon camera was examined, investigators uncovered a chilling thread. The last photographs, snapped between 10 and 11 a.m. on July 13th, showed blurred pieces of shoreline, patches of aquatic plants, and then, captured faintly in one frame, a silhouette of a motorboat moored at the pier of the abandoned fishing base. The very same base locals said had been closed for more than 5 years. The base's registered owner had a criminal record for poaching. Police logged the evidence, but it wasn't enough for an arrest. The active search carried on for 4 more days, divers and boats circling the 5-mile radius of the lake. Nothing surfaced. On paper, the case became stagnant, left officially open but suspended. The files padded only by witness testimonies and the photos salvaged from Daniel's memory card. A year later, in late August of 2019, a water resources inspector patrolling the eastern shore reported something unsettling: signs of human activity around the long-abandoned fishing base, fresh footprints in wet sand, a smoldered campfire, plastic food containers with expiration dates only days old. The base itself remained in ruins: collapsed piers, a warehouse with rusted gates, an access road overtaken by weeds. On August 29th, a joint team of parish officers and Coast Guard personnel combed through the site. Inside one warehouse, under heaps of broken oars and torn nets, they found a synthetic fishing net tangled with old anchor ropes. As they dragged it into the daylight, a crunching sound froze them in place. Inside the net were human bones. Forensic experts later confirmed the remains had been submerged for weeks before washing ashore and entangling in the ropes. Alongside them lay 2 metal carabiners, fragments of rubberized fabric resembling a life jacket, and a shard of plastic from a paddle blade. Laboratory analysis soon closed the loop. On September 25th, DNA results returned with a match. The bones were those of Daniel Mercer. His family was notified. The missing person case was now officially a murder investigation, and yet the lake still refused to give up all its secrets. During a deeper sweep of the fishing base, officers uncovered a hidden cavity beneath the warehouse floorboards, a crude pit carefully covered with wooden planks. Beneath the warehouse floorboards of the abandoned fishing base, officers uncovered more than just a crude pit. Tucked inside the cavity were objects that seemed ordinary on the surface: old canisters with fuel residue, coils of synthetic rope, a box of corroded fishing hooks, and a knife with a cracked handle. But under the sterile lights of the parish forensic lab, those items transformed into damning evidence. The knife's blade, pitted with corrosion, carried microscopic traces of organic material. The analysis was unambiguous. The DNA matched Daniel Mercer. Attention quickly turned toward the man tied to the site: Harold M. Barlow, 62 years old, a weathered figure with a long history of skirting the law. His record stretched back decades. In the 90s, he had served time for smuggling fish and seafood out of the Gulf. In the mid-2000s, his name appeared in a narcotics trafficking case, though charges slipped through due to lack of evidence. More recently, parish records noted convictions for poaching and illegal trafficking in fishing gear. On paper, the fishing base had been abandoned since 2013. In reality, locals whispered they had seen Barlow there at night, his motorboat lingering in the waters near the same pier Daniel photographed. That was enough for investigators to secure a warrant. At Barlow's home, they discovered empty boxes from plastic gear containers identical to those at the base, along with pieces of tarpaulin matching the fabric wrapped around the recovered remains. On October 4th, 2019, officers took Barlow into custody. He did not resist. Sitting in the interrogation room, he insisted from the beginning, "I had nothing to do with Daniel Mercer." But investigators had come prepared. They placed photographs from Daniel's recovered camera on the table, grainy, distant images, but one frame showed a motorboat moored at the decaying pier, its outline unmistakable. Standing nearby was a man resembling Barlow. He denied it outright, claiming the boat was no longer his. Yet forensic evidence piled up quickly. DNA on the knife, rope fibers matching netting found at the base, and rope seized from his home. Cell tower data placing his phone within range of the base on the day Daniel vanished. For hours Barlow stonewalled, but the turning point came when investigators zoomed into one of Daniel's final photos. Enlarged, it revealed a logo painted on the motorboat's hull. The insignia matched precisely with Barlow's registered boat, sold only months after the disappearance. The room shifted. Barlow demanded a break. When he returned 40 minutes later, his defiance had drained away. He agreed to speak. The confession that followed was chilling. On the morning of July 13th, Barlow claimed he had been unloading plastic containers filled with contraband under the cover of night at the fishing base. He believed no one had seen him. But Daniel, paddling near the area, had unknowingly photographed the scene. Hours later, when Barlow spotted the kayaker again passing by, realization struck. If the images reached authorities, his quiet operation would unravel. Barlow admitted he chased Daniel down in his motorboat under the pretext of conversation. He drew close, then struck Daniel with an oar, knocking him into the water. Daniel, true to habit, wore his life jacket and tried to push away, but Barlow unfurled a fishing net, ensnaring him beneath the hull. He hooked the net onto his anchor line and dragged Daniel under. Resistance ceased quickly. Barlow claimed he then towed the kayak toward the newly formed crater near the shoreline and shoved it into the funnel, confident the depths would hide it forever. Daniel's body, he said, was hauled deeper into the lake before being discarded. Barlow believed the current would carry it away, but the net snagged on submerged debris from an old pier. Weeks later, the remains washed ashore, entangled in the very fishing gear investigators later recovered. He admitted to discarding the camera and memory card in a southern marsh, though specialized teams failed to recover it. Based on his confession, the forensic evidence, and his prior record, Barlow was charged with first-degree murder and illegal drug trafficking. In court, the weight of his past crimes bore down heavily. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Even with Barlow behind bars, investigators sought to reconstruct every detail of Daniel's final day. Digital forensics specialists turned back to the photographs in Daniel's waterproof bag, extracting metadata, timestamps, GPS coordinates, and precise angles. After Harold Barlow confessed, investigators knew his words had to be tested against hard data. A confession could be twisted or minimized, but numbers, timestamps, and photographs did not lie. The Digital Forensics Unit was tasked with rebuilding Daniel Mercer final morning on Lake Katusa, down to the minute. The photographs on Daniel's Canon camera provided the skeleton of the timeline. The first frame was taken at 10:08 a.m., capturing the northeastern shore, about a mile and a half from where he launched. It showed calm water and a stretch of vegetation leaning heavy after the week's rains. Subsequent images revealed Daniel's progression along the eastern edge, stopping to photograph abandoned buildings, tangled roots, and flooded inlets. Then came the frame that changed everything. 10:42 a.m., the motorboat at the pier. A man in dark clothing and a baseball cap stood in the still air, frozen in the frame. Experts noted that the lake that morning was glass smooth, the air utterly calm. Any sound, an oar striking water, a voice raised, would have carried unnaturally far, Barlow's boat GPS log, installed years earlier by his insurer, filled in the rest. At 10:55 a.m., the device recorded the boat leaving the pier and accelerating southwest. At 11:03 a.m., the log showed speed dropping nearly to zero the moment Daniel's kayak was intercepted. Local fishermen, re-interviewed, confirmed seeing the boat idle in open water at the same time. One noted its strange behavior, standing motionless before swinging back toward the abandoned base. Hydrology experts added another key layer. The crater where Daniel's kayak was found had already existed underwater at the time of the murder. The shoreline was stable, which meant the kayak had not been dragged in by chance. It had been deliberately forced into that funnel of rock. Minute by minute, the reconstruction formed a chilling sequence. 9:08 a.m. Daniel launched from the north shore. 9:37 a.m. He passed the first turn along the eastern edge. 10:42 a.m. He photographed Barlow's motorboat at the pier. 10:52 a.m. Barlow began pursuit. 11:03 a.m. The confrontation on open water. The kayak struck. 11:10 a.m. Barlow's boat returned toward the base, carrying the net and Daniel's body. This reconstruction dismantled Barlow's early claims that panic, not intent, had dictated his actions. It revealed a man who planned quickly, acted decisively, and then tried to bury every trace of what he had done. The trial opened on May 5, 2020, in the LaSalle County Circuit Court. Security was tight. Reporters, residents, and students of law crowded the benches, some curious, others furious. For the Mercer family, it was the moment they had been waiting for, to see the man they believed responsible face judgment. Daniel's brother Thomas sat in the front row, his hands clasped so tightly they barely moved. His mother Evelyn stared straight ahead, refusing to look away. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision. The first exhibit, the knife, hidden beneath the warehouse, its blade scarred by corrosion, yet still carrying Daniel's DNA. Then came the net, the very one that had entangled Daniel's bones, chemically identical to coils of rope seized from Barlow's home. Jurors leaned forward when prosecutors projected Daniel's final photographs onto a large screen. The image of Barlow's motorboat loomed in the courtroom, time-stamped and corroborated by GPS data. One enlarged shot even showed Barlow himself, standing on the pier, frozen in Daniel's lens just minutes before he vanished. Expert witnesses followed. Hydrologists explained how the kayak could only have entered the crater by deliberate force. Cell phone records placed Barlow in the coverage area of the eastern shore that morning. His evening calls tied him back to networks of illicit trade. Piece by piece, the puzzle closed in. The defense struggled. Barlow's attorneys argued procedural errors in evidence handling. They insisted Daniel's death was a tragic accident during a heated confrontation. But the defense could not erase the videotaped confession spoken in Barlow's own voice, in the presence of his lawyer. Nor could they explain away new witness testimony. One fisherman, Joseph Joe Halpin, testified he had seen a bundle on Barlow's boat that day, a net with something dark inside. His words struck the jury like a hammer. Daniel's body had likely been on that deck within minutes of the attack. By the third week of testimony, the narrative was unshakable. Barlow had acted calmly, not frantically. He had drowned Daniel, concealed the kayak, and destroyed evidence, the missing camera most of all. When the jury left to deliberate, the room fell silent, the air heavy with a year's worth of grief and anger. On June 12, 2020, after 8 hours, the jurors returned. Their verdict: guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, destruction of evidence, and illegal trafficking of narcotics. The judge, stern and unyielding, sentenced Barlow to life imprisonment without parole. He noted the crime's severity was aggravated not only by murder, but by its motive, an attempt to protect deeper criminal activity. Outside the courthouse, the focus shifted from the jury's verdict to the community that had lived through the case alongside the family. In a public statement, the parish fire chief expressed gratitude to every responder who had stepped forward during the search. He acknowledged their tireless efforts, saying their skill, their specialized equipment, and above all their determination were essential in bringing this case to its conclusion. Not long after, the parish mayor offered words of sympathy that carried across the crowd. He spoke directly to the families, neighbors, and friends who had carried the weight of uncertainty for more than a year. "Our deepest condolences go to all who have been touched by this tragedy," he said. "Daniel's story has left a mark on this community, and we share in the grief of those who knew and loved him." The trial had ended, the sentence delivered, yet Lake Katusa still held its shadows. The missing life jacket, the camera never recovered, and the silence of those last minutes sealed forever beneath the water.